Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of Ephesians. And today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Chris Rexroad, and our question comes from Ephesians chapter 4. And he begins chapter 4 by saying this: "Therefore I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God. Always be humble and gentle, be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. For there is one body and one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious hope for the future." So he begins by saying, he says, live a life worthy of your calling. What is a life worthy of our calling? What does that look like?
Definitely a submitted life where we have to give up ourselves and actually follow him. And like we talked about yesterday too, you would see transformation in this, but it's basically just the willingness to go and say, your will, not my will. And he gives us a list of things here for how we can get along with one another and grow in healthy relationships. And hopefully that will be a reflection of Christ to people around us, specifically the non-believers.
Yeah, I think he gives some very specific. I would say this is all inclusive, but these are some general areas that if we're going to live a life worthy of our calling and reflecting who Jesus is or should be in our life. Because when you think through these things, first of all, he talks about being a prisoner for serving the Lord. That's, to me, speaks of 100% commitment. You're all in, regardless of what the cost is. I think that's first and foremost. Is you just got to be there. You got to be all in. I remember years ago you preached a message about being all in. You had some chips and you
Some poker chips.
Yeah, I haven't forgot that. But see how powerful that was. But being all in, I think that's the first step. Then he gets into some practical things about being humble and gentle and patient with each other. Because the truth of the matter, I'm speaking for myself. Just to measure if you're living a life worthy of your calling and representative of who Christ is, just those things alone, being humble and gentle and patient with other people, it's like, got a lot to work on, because those are high markers right there to keep up with. And then he talks about...
And he says always
be humble and gentle. And I always get that right, except when I don't, and which is a lot of the times, but we've talked previously in other podcast recently about how that's a work in progress, and the reality is, am I more consistent at that now than I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Thank God the answer is yes. Is there a lot of room when I look forward to where I need to get in that regard? 100%. But it is a work in progress, and he talks about being unified in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. And so these are some big things that he laid out here that if you just read through it, you're like, well, yeah, that's simple, but it's not simple.
Humility, for me, I don't find to be difficult. Meaning, I know I am so flawed that I can't think too highly of myself, But I'm not a gentle person in any way, shape, or form. I can try, and there are times I genuinely am, but and I begin to think, do I know people who are gentle but not humble? And I could think of some.
Yeah.
I could think of some who were like, they were just so gentle when the words, they were never harsh with their words. But every time they spoke, whatever you had said, they had done it bigger, better,
faster.
Yeah, whatever, and so they weren't gentle. They were gentle.
Mm-hmm.
They were gently arrogant.
New phrase, gently arrogant. But it's true.
And he says they both they go together.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just be humble, because if you're humble, you can still be harsh. Some people think because we know that is one of the things that makes me not so gentle. Is because I am self-aware. I know my limitations, and I can just lay it out there, and I'm fine with that. But because I just want to deal with, here, let's just deal with what we got to deal with. But other people are different, and then he says, after that, be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. We have got to learn to make allowances for each other's faults. I'm wrestling through something I'm thinking about writing or teaching or something at some point. And there are a multitude of things that started it. But we live in a culture right now that if you hate something, for us to be friends, I also have to hate what you hate.
Yeah.
And that just can't be true. Mm. I was having a conversation the other day with a guy, and he said, I hate Chick-fil-A. I said, you're going to hell. That's what I said to him. Food. Just that quick. I said, you're going to hell. Mm. And he was like, what are you talking about? And, he went on to tell me why he despised Chick-fil-A. And I said to him, he said, I just don't understand why people like it. And I said, well, I don't understand why people hate it. Mm. But in the conversation, we got to talking, and I said, we live in a culture, though, that if you hate it, I'm supposed to hate it too. Mm-hmm. And if I love it, you have to love it too, or we can't be friends. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that just is not the case, because whatever bad experience he had at Chick-fil-A, he went to the wrong Chick-fil-A. He went to one in Elizabeth City.
I could have guessed that.
You pick any fast food in Elizabeth City, they all got the same struggles. There went my throwing shade. And I love Zaxby's. Mm-hmm. Same thing, same problem. But anyway, he had a bad experience. He didn't like it. Whatever. I love it. Like if I'm going by a Chick-fil-A and I got options for lunch, Chick-fil-A is pretty close to the top. Yep. The only thing close is like a Shake Shack or Five Guys that's going to give it some competition. But I don't have to hate it. And so one of the things we have to learn is to be patient with one another. Mm-hmm. Because we, all three of us sitting here on this podcast, have different gifts, and we all have different flaws. Mm-hmm. We all have different weaknesses. And if we can't learn, I think it's a piece of the personality traits that I have, that I can make allowance for people's faults. I can separate that from the person. It's the strangest thing, but most people can't. I would struggle more with gentleness than I would being able to make allowance for each other's faults. Because this is their struggle, but this is who they are. I mean, this is the person, and they're not the same to me. And all of us, we see the world through a different lens. We approach life in a different way, and we have to make those allowances. I can't expect you to hate the same things I hate, and that's a strong word. Yeah. Or to love the same things I love. Jay and you and I have traveled enough that you may not enjoy the same things I enjoy, or want to do the same things I want to do, or go to the same, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. That's true. But it can't be. The same is true in marriage.
100%.
Yeah. You don't get to have it your way all the time.
Because one of the things that we cover a lot in marriage counseling, particularly pre-marriage counseling under communication, is that you have to be intentional about separating the issue from the person.
Right.
And if you can ever get to that place where you can deal with the issue, but not attach that to the person, then you can move on down the road and you can grow and accomplish some great things. And it's the same thing whether it's in church, at work, family. And I'll confess, it at times, depending on the issue, is a difficult thing for me to do on the front end, to separate the issue from the person. But thank God, again, it's an area where I have grown in some.
Yeah. And he says, make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit. Mm. Every effort. Mm-hmm. The enemy wants nothing more than to divide. Yes. Ever how subtly he can do that, and that's how he begins. Is trying to create small pieces of division to where we can't move forward. We can't function, and a life worthy of our calling is to try to stay unified with my brothers and sisters in the Lord, not to, well, you can't be saved if you don't X. Now, I think there are some lines in the sand you got to draw.
I think one of the things that we run into these days is what I usually recall the grace crutch, that these things that he listed that we need to do, we want to go and say, well, I'm under Jesus' grace. That he'll forgive me for this. He knows this is just who I am, and that they'll continue to do that. And anytime that I see a therefore, and you guys know that too, I want to go back to the last chapter and see what he said. And he said, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but what is helpful for building people up according to their needs, that they may benefit to those who listen, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. And then he goes on to talk about getting rid of all this bitterness and anger and stuff. And I think a lot of times people will justify their actions because they feel like they're just like covered with this grace, which is true. I mean, the grace is new every day. Thank goodness for that, or we'd all be in trouble. But I think that's an unhealthy thing that people can get into. And I've heard groups of people kind of adopt that mentality. And I think it's very dangerous.
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the verses we were in about being patient with each other, making allowance for their faults because of your love. I think it's easier for us to make, quote, an allowance for a person's fault if it's a singular one and done. But if it's a repetitive or reoccurring thing, and speaking for myself, it's easy for me to go, they know better now. So
it wears us down.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It does. But ultimately, love has to be the motivation. And as you pointed out, verse 3, make every effort to keep yourselves united. Sometimes that means we just keep loving in spite of.
Yeah, sometimes we just have to suck it up.
Yes.
Say, as much as we hate this is who they are, it is who they are. And until God is ready to deal with it.
Right, till he changes them.
Yeah. Or we learn the lesson that we need to learn from it. Because, I'm firmly convinced that God brings people in our lives sometimes for us to learn lessons. And that person don't change, but they're there for us to learn something. Yeah. And, we think we're there to help them change. And God's, he's like, no, they're present for you to change, And that's difficult.
Yes, it is. And that makes me think through some things and see it a little bit differently. I'm going to try to start making a list of lessons I need to learn so he'll letting people move on.
Yeah, if you ain't going to change them, Lord, let's learn what I got to learn quick.
Teach me and let's go on.
Thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us next week as we start a conversation around the book of Colossians.